Welcome to this first lesson of understanding the basics of photography. The first thing we're going to go into is the aperture value mode. Now, what is the aperture value mode? It's a mode on your camera, which is called AV. You have, a little wheel on the camera where you can choose different mode, and this one is called AV. And the whole idea of the aperture mode is that you decide what the aperture is, and the camera is going to decide what time is going to open the shutter of the camera. Now, what is the aperture? The aperture is this little piece of metal that gives different size of holes. This aperture can be small or the hole can be big, and we say we have a big aperture. So what type of sizes do we have? Well, when the diaphragm or the aperture is completely open, we say it's open at f1.4. When the size of the aperture is a bit smaller, we are at f2.8. When the size is a bit smaller, it's at f.4, and when it's really small, it's at f16, which is a bit strange because bigger the number, smaller the aperture. Why is that? Because it's basically a mathematical formula. Well, if you divide 1 by 1.4, you get a size, and that's going to be the diameter of the circle of the aperture. If you divide 1 by 1.4, you get something like 0.7 or 0.8, and that's going to be the size of the diameter of the aperture. If you divide 1 by 2.8, you will get a smaller number because you have a smaller diameter. If you divide 1 by 4, you get 0.25, you get a smaller aperture. If you divide 1 by 16, you get an even smaller number, and you get a smaller aperture or smaller hole. So bigger the number, smaller is the aperture. Now, what does it do to have a big or a small aperture? Well, what it does, it handles what we call the depth of field. The depth of field is, this drawing is taken from the side. You have the camera, you have the aperture, and you have these trees. The very light green trees are blurry. They are not sharp. The trees which are dark green are very sharp, and these trees again are not sharp. So if you look from the side, you see that when the aperture is big, you have a small number like f1.4 or f2. So that means the aperture is totally open. You have a small depth of field. It's going to be very narrow. We say we have a narrow depth of field. Now, if you close a bit the diaphragm and get a smaller aperture, your depth of field is getting bigger. And if you make it even smaller, your depth of field is getting even bigger. So now what does that mean to have a big depth of field or a small depth of field? What does it look like? Well, let's check it out. That's what it looks like. Here we have a big aperture, 2.8. The aperture is very large, the hole is big, and you can see that the status is sharp and the background is completely blurry. So it's basically an artistic decision. I want to get something sharp and the rest blurry, so I'm going to go for a big aperture, 2.8 for example. And your lens, basically, some lenses can only open at 4. These are usually more cheaper lens, and the more professional lens, you can open the aperture, usually they are bigger, you can open up to 2.8 for example. So this is the opposite. We close the aperture very much at f20, and now we have the status which is sharp, but we also have the background which is getting more sharp. It's not completely sharp, but it's not as blurry as this. So it's really an artistic decision. Do I want, what do I want sharp? What do I want in focus? Basically, big aperture are used to take portraits, to make it simple, and small aperture with big numbers is to take landscapes, because in landscape we want most of it to be sharp. Now, one thing you should know is that as the aperture is getting big, wide open, the quantity of light to get a proper exposure that the camera needs is very little, because the aperture is big, so the light is coming very fast. So look at the speed. The speed here was 1/640th of a second. That's a light speed. And now that we have a close aperture, that was smaller hole, the speed was 1/40th of a second, which is still fast, but it's a lot slower than 160/40th of a second. Because in AV mode, you decide the f-stop, and the computer within the camera is going to decide the time to make a proper exposure. So basically you have a scene. Do I want to make a portrait? Do I want to make a landscape? You take an artistic decision of, if you want everything in focus or just something not in focus. And so that's, where you go f2.8 or f20 or f10 or whatever. And we're going to see a lot of examples of that later on. And the camera is going to decide the time. Now that's what the AV mode is. Next, we're going to see the TV mode, which is a time value mode, which is the opposite.